Is Death Knight coming to Hearthstone? I think maybe. Yeah, there's been a lot of rumors and some leaks suggesting that a new class, Death Knight, will be added to Hearthstone later this year. So I wanted to see what you guys thought Death Knight cards might look like if indeed this were added to Hearthstone. So these are some custom Death Knight cards, kicking things off here with Chains of Ice from Jay Ballister, which is absolutely terrifying because it made me realize, oh my god, we're getting another freeze themed class in Hearthstone, and freeze has really felt like a thorn in my side lately. I think a lot of people are frustrated by the pervasiveness of freeze mages across various game modes, and cards like this, as terrifying as it might be, could be in our future if Death Knight shows up. This is a 5-mana legendary frost spell that will freeze all enemy minions wherever they are. And listen, this can't exist. I included this in here to kick off the video and get some comments stirring and to address the theme of frost here and how terrifying it might be. But this would theoretically freeze minions even in your opponent's deck. So if they were played out after being drawn, or in hand too, I guess, they would still be frozen. They would be preemptively frozen, essentially missing their first attack phase. So like rush minions wouldn't be able to attack right away, or charge minions, and then normal minions would have to wait an extra turn to attack, which would be, and while I love the fact that this is a legendary spell, so it's limited to 1 of in your deck, I think this would need to cost like 10 mana to even remotely feel okay. And even then, I would absolutely hate for a card like this to exist. Now, that said, you know, not that unrealistic by Blizzard standards these days. We have a lot of freeze that's very prevalent across Hearthstone. So Jay Ballister might have tapped into something fairly realistic here. Just a card I absolutely cannot support the existence of. So well made, great flavor, somewhat realistic perhaps, just absolutely not a card I would welcome into the game. Sorry, Jay. Now that said, Death Knights aren't just about frost. They certainly have other kinds of specs in World of Warcraft, one of which is Blood Death Knights. It's all about blood magic, and this one taps into that a little bit with Relish in Blood from Dat Mage Doe, a 1-mana spell for Death Knight. It destroys all friendly minions and then draws a card for each. So I like that this is tapping into that sacrificing your stuff in order to gain some benefit. We could see Death Knight utilize this, having a bunch of like cheap minions or cheap throwaway tokens or death rattle synergies that they're looking to activate, and a card like this could be a great enabler to both give them the card draw they need, but also to activate death rattles or throw away things that proc infuse or other similar style effects that could show up in a blood focused synergy build for Death Knight. So I think this card would be a great engine for that kind of deck, and really showcases that side of the gameplay that could certainly exist, I think, for Death Knights. So next up here we have Forlorn Banshee from Magic Milk, a 3-mana 3/2 undead Death Knight minion, and we'll talk more about undead, but this card captured another element I thought could be cool for Death Knights. It has a death rattle that shuffles 2 Despondent Whales into your opponent's deck. Those are some cast when drawn cards. That makes the opponent take 2 damage, but then also will restore 2 health to you because you're the enemy hero when those are drawn. And I like this idea of Death Knights having a like long, grindy, you know, chip damage and life gain sort of element to them. And a card like this captures that really well, almost like a damage over time sort of style of play, where you're just chipping them for 1 or 2 damage, slowly kind of working them down, grinding away at them, gaining similarly small amounts of life over time yourself. That feels like a play style that, yeah, sometimes things like Warlock kind of capture that, but I think Death Knight could really lean into that. And something like Forlorn Banshee ties that together with death rattles and undead. Feels like a very realistic card as far as I'm concerned. But I just love that idea of like a slow, tanky, grinded out sort of game plan for Death Knights. I think that could be a really fun sort of build. So next up from Jono Avocado, we've got runes. I think runes are a big part of Death Knights. I honestly have never played a Death Knight in World of Warcraft, but a lot of you came up with rune ideas, so it must be. This is a 2-mana spell, Rune Forging, that allows you to discover a rune to forge onto your weapon. It replaces any previous rune, and Jono has included some rune samples here. The Rune of Razor Ice is +2 attack and freeze any character damaged by this minion, so some nice stall and disruption there. The Rune of Spell Warding is +1 +1 durability to your weapon, and enemy spell damage -1. I like this kind of anti-magic aspect to Death Knights showing up there. Is pretty cool. Rune of the Apocalypse reads, after your hero attacks, your minions get +1 attack this turn, so that could play into those wide boards of small throwaway tokens for an undead swarm sort of thing. And then Rune of the Fallen Crusader is +1 attack and life steal. So a little bit more blood oriented there, gaining some life along the way. And each of these feel like they do something pretty cool and might make a weapon pretty powerful. And for 2 mana, these feel like very strong modifiers. So the balance here probably comes in a little bit with how good Death Knight weapons would be, but Death Knights are famed for the rune blades, and I think this would be a great way to support that. And kind of feels like poisons for rogue, but different and unique and certainly specific to Death Knights. And I like the way you can't stack these up according to this. It replaces any previous runes, so you're kind of focused in on doing that one thing for your weapon, not creating this like super monster weapon, but being a little bit adaptable perhaps throughout the course of the game. That feels like a really satisfying loop to me. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about our sponsor for this video. It's Keeps. Yeah, did you know 2 out of 3 guys will experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they're 35 years old? And the best way to prevent hair loss is to do something while you still have hair left. And thankfully, Keeps makes it super easy. You can get treated right from home. You talk to a doctor online and they'll send your prescription right to your door. It's as easy as can be, leaving you plenty of time to play Death Knights when they finally hit Hearthstone, if they do. So if you're noticing you're losing your hair, it's time to finally do something about it. For a limited time, you can go to keeps.com/Regis or check out that link down there in that description for 50% off your first order. Moving on here to Soul Reaper from Maz Kinnan, a 4-mana shadow spell for Death Knights. And I like this one. It's pretty simple. It's sort of a swipe or a dunk tank converted into Death Knight world. It reads, deal 4 damage. If the target dies, deal 2 damage to all enemies. And this feels like one of those cards that would be like a staple piece of the Death Knight package. You need these building block cards, these reliable tools. This is a card that mixes face damage with some board clear potential as well. And I like the conditionality here being based on death. That feels, of course, very fitting for Death Knights. So it's got this upside, but you've got to trigger this specific death-based condition. That's awesome. On top of that, that adds a nice little balancing element to this card, I think, as well, because you can't, for instance, send 6 damage to face with this card, because if you hit face for 4, the target's not dying, or if it did, you didn't need the 2 damage anyway, right? So it kind of limits the face reach potential of this card, but still gives it that really powerful board clear upside, given board shapes lining up nicely for you. So, you know, nothing too flashy with this card. Not some big, awesome, crazy effect, but it feels super realistic. It feels like the sort of card that would pop up in most Death Knight decks and just become that reliable staple for the class. Next up here is Dominate Will from Catch 22, a 3-mana Death Knight spell. This one allows you to take control of a minion with equal or less attack than your hero. So this is a pretty powerful tool, potentially like a mind control in essence. It doesn't say take control this turn. It's literally just take control. So a really powerful removal tool, but it's limited here by the attack of your hero. And I like the idea of this, that you've got this really powerful effect, but it has this nice limitation built into it. Could be played in something like a weapon build. We've seen some rune stuff already that plays nicely into this, but there's a natural balancing element here where like maybe Death Knight weapons just aren't that big on average. You know, maybe they're like 4 attack. It's pretty hard to get to for Death Knight weapons. Maybe they're more about their effects as opposed to their raw damage output. And that relegates a card like this from a power level standpoint, because maybe you're only taking things like 3 or 4 attack, and that feels a little more fair. I still think this could probably go up a mana cost or 2, but capturing an iconic Lich King sort of ability here, playing into weapon synergies, which, you know, that seems like something Death Knight could definitely lean into. That feels like a nice fitting card. I'd like to see effects like this for sure. Next up here, we have Darian Mograine from Nightmare 1983, and really excited to see this one because Darian's really one of the most iconic Death Knights, and wielding the corrupted Ashbringer gives us a great connection back to Tyrion Forgering, and you can see a lot of that design reflected here in Darien. This is basically like a modern, re-envisioned version of Tyrion, rebalanced for today's Hearthstone, because Tyrion's really not very good these days. He is a 6-mana 6/5 with Taunt and Lifesteal instead of Divine Shield, and Death Rattle equipped Corrupted Ashbringer, and the Ashbringer has Lifesteal in this case since it has been corrupted. So this is clearly, I think, a lot more powerful than a card like Tyrion. This is a lot of stuff for 6 mana. That weapon alone is already really powerful, comparable to the Libram Paladin weapon, but it's attached already to a body with some nice upside. So yeah, this is a very powerful looking card. There's a lot of stuff going on here. Might be too good, but I'm okay with pushing things a little bit for a new class and an important character. I think it's nice to have these really strong iconic characters to attach people to the class and make them feel welcome. Card like this could certainly welcome Death Knight really nicely, and you know, maybe it's a 7-mana 5/5, maybe it's just a 6-mana 5/5, maybe the Ashbringer's only got 2 durability this time. There's a few ways you could tweak this one, but I'm okay with putting this one out pretty strong. This, I think, would be one of people's favorite cards if Death Knight showed up. Next up here we have Fetch from Northwest, and this is a reference to Arthas, who showed up previously in Knights of the Frozen Throne, beloved character, apparently Lich King's pet dog, and in this case Lich King sending him out on a fetch here to discover a copy of a spell in your deck. That's an effect we know is really nice, and this has a bonus too, gives the original cast when drawn. So find something powerful in your deck, tutor that out, but also make that next one an immediate cast if you can grab it again or find it shortly thereafter, which, yeah, that seems like a cool card and certainly plays into the flavor of your pet dog going to find you something. And I really wanted to include this one because, you know, Hearthstone ultimately has some cute and goofy elements, and Death Knights often are like as far removed from that as possible. Big, crazy, scary, evil looking dudes. You know, there's not a lot of cute and cuddly stuff going on with Death Knights. So I would expect a card like this or two to show up to lighten Death Knights a little bit, lighten the mood, ease it up, give them that softer side, and certainly playing into Arthas is one way to do that. So don't be shocked that cards like this do make their way into an otherwise really grim and dark Death Knight class. So next up here we have Screaming Geist from Sunbird 1002. This would be a 2-mana 4/1 undead minion, and includes here some synergies for undead. Battlecry: the next undead you summon attacks random enemy minions until it dies. So I really like this card because it gives us an idea for what undead could look like if that were indeed to be a new minion type. And I think Ixar has teased this quite a bit on Twitter. I think it's quite possible undead becomes a minion type, maybe a focus for Death Knights especially. And you can see with a card like this one, right, if this worked with a really big minion, right, if you had like an 8/8 to follow this up, that might be too powerful. But I like that this card showcases an alignment where it's a high attack, low health, and probably encourages undead minions being these like throwaway swarms of smaller stuff. Maybe they have death rattles, maybe they're 1/1s or 2/1s, but this idea that there's just an endless horde of them and you just keep summoning them and throwing them at your opponent, and you know, who cares if they die, they're just part of your endless swarm. I think that's a really cool flavor fit for Death Knights and Arthas and the Lich King. So this, I think, it really captures what I think undead could be as a minion type. We've even got some other undead stuff as far back as classic, scaling off of minion deaths with like Flesh Eating Ghoul, for instance. So I think this really captured the spirit of what I think undead will be rather nicely in a nice, tidy, tight design here from Sunbird. Finally, here we have Alcard the Damned from Lil Sunflora. This is a 4-mana 4/5 undead. Battlecry: choose a friendly minion, turn its Battlecry into a death rattle. And I thought this was a really cool mechanic that could maybe even extend beyond this card, where you take, you know, minions that are living beings doing their thing, having battle cries or rush or other keywords, and then utilizing your Death Knight cards to take those living beings and do something with them again in death. Basically the notion of a Death Knight, resurrecting things, undead, etc. So turning battle cries into death rattles seemed like a really neat way to capture that idea. Maybe you have another card that turns a rush into something, a taunt into something, or, you know, all into death rattles perhaps. But I think that's a cool way to get extra value out of your cards and seemed like a nifty different gameplay loop I haven't seen in Hearthstone as much before. So that could be a cool way to play into the death side of things that I hadn't really thought of otherwise. You know, I think it's really cool to envision these cards not just as like individual cards. This is a nice little standalone legendary, could do its own thing, but it can also be the foundation or setup for the archetypes or the builds or the sorts of things you'd see Death Knight become as a class altogether. And I wanted to explore cards that I think captured both sides of that, which Alcar is a perfect example for. And that said, that wraps it up for this video. Thanks for joining me for some Death Knight designs. I am beyond pumped if we're indeed getting Death Knight in the 3rd expansion of the year. Can't wait to see ideas like these executed in real live Hearthstone. That said, share your thoughts on these cards in the comments below. What do you think for Death Knight? Do you think we're actually getting Death Knight? I want to hear all your conspiracy theories and more down there in the comments. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.